In this lecture, we're going to apply our setting terms to a work of fiction, in particular, Susan Glaspell's Jury of Her Peers. Let's start with the general setting. Generally speaking, this story is set in the early 20th century, and it's set in rural America. That gives us a sense of the framework for the plot that's going to take place. For example, small details like Hale talking about how he stopped at his neighbor's farm to see if Wright would go in with him on a telephone line make a lot more sense if we think about that time frame of the early 20th century when the telephone was just starting to be expanded throughout the United States. And keeping in mind that we're out in rural America where people are living on farms and at great distance from each other, it makes sense that Mrs. Hale could have gone for more than a year without visiting her neighbor. So those elements of the general setting help us understand the details of the text and establish the rules that the world of this piece of fiction uses as a framework. So in terms of the temporal setting, there are a few different elements that we can take a look at. This one is a good example to think about the duration of the plot action. We start the text with Mrs. Hale being picked up by the sheriff and the rest of the party who are going over to the Wright's house to take a look at the crime scene. And the action is continuous and unbroken through the end when they leave. That plot action is one continuous chunk of time, a few hours at most. Hale's witness statement looks back to an earlier moment in time, obviously, when he came to visit Wright and found Mrs. Wright there and first heard that Wright was dead. Those are a few of the particular elements of the temporal setting. The physical setting is also really interesting in this text. We basically have just two physical settings that we see described, and one is Mrs. Hale's kitchen, and the other is Mrs. Wright's kitchen, where the bulk of the narrative takes place as the women are, sort of sorting through Mrs. Wright's things and choosing what to bring to her, and of course, where they make all of these evidentiary discoveries. What's interesting is while the women stay in that one physical setting in Mrs. Wright's kitchen, the men are wandering about other places. They go upstairs to see the bedroom where Wright's body was found. They go out looking in the barn to see what evidence they can find out there. The one place that they don't search and they don't think any evidence could be is there in the kitchen, where most of the story actually takes place. So let's talk about some of the details of those physical settings. The text actually opens with Martha Hale looking at her own kitchen and thinking about her dissatisfaction with leaving things, as it says in the text, half done. Her eye made a scandalized sweep of her kitchen. It was no ordinary thing that called her away, but what her eye took in was that her kitchen was in no shape for leaving, her bread all ready for mixing, half the flour sifted and half unsifted. She hated to see things undone. It's setting up this really interesting framework where Mrs. Hale is thinking about her own work as undone and that this is not a state to leave the kitchen in. The kitchen is also the focus in terms of the setting at the Wrights, and there's a lot of criticism of the state of the kitchen on behalf of the men. So for example, this is around paragraph 70 or so, the county attorney was looking at the cupboard, peculiar, ungainly structure, half closet, half cupboard, the upper part being built in the wall, lower part just the old-fashioned kitchen cupboard. As if its queerness attracted him, he got a chair and opened the upper part and looked in. After a moment, he drew his hand away, sticky. "Here's a nice mess," he said resentfully. And the women, on the other hand, are very sympathetic because what has happened is because the house was so cold without the fire, her canned fruit basically expanded and exploded. And then the next minute, the guy goes over to use the towels to wipe his hand and notices that there are dirty towels. And this is around paragraph 80. Not much of a housekeeper, would you say, ladies? And this is where Mrs. Hale, this is the trigger where she starts getting a little bit defensive of her friend. There's a great deal of work to be done on a farm, says Mrs. Hale stiffly. And notice even just that word choice, stiffly, gives us a sense of what's going on. And she comments just a little later on, those towels get dirty awful quick. Men's hands aren't always as clean as they might be. So these small details of the setting, these specific details, help to create the conflict among the characters. And in particular, in this text, obviously, that conflict is drawn along gender lines, as the men have a real definite sense about, what evidence, what that is, what that means, and the fact that, for example, you're not going to find evidence among women's things in the kitchen, and they're very dismissive of domestic items and that kitchen space where the women spend most of their time and where the story is mainly set. Of course, as the story goes on, we find, the women find the cage and the dead bird, and obviously these are elements that are very important to the plot of the text. Again, these specific detailed elements that are parts of the physical setting. And so the more detailed that you get with those descriptions and identifying and even analyzing the specific word choices used to describe the setting or to comment on the setting, as in the case of when Mrs. Hale starts to speak stiffly to the county attorney, you can really begin to use setting as an analytical tool.